I was once a body double for a head lice advert.
David's team.
What do you mean a body double?
I had head lice at the time.
OK.
They show the boy, and then they show the back of the head with the lice. I was not the boy, but that back of the head, and those are my lice.
So when they were casting the advert, they thought, well, we can't cast someone who's necessarily infested themselves.
The lady who invented the comb, it was her son.
Which comb are we talking about?
The Knitbusters comb.
Knitbusters.
Yeah.
Sorry, the person that invented the comb for head lice,
yeah,
her son was in the advert.
It's called nepotism, David.
Odd name for your son.
Yeah. Where are we in Australia, Sam?
Oh, you're not having one of your breakdowns again, are you?
This is in Queensland, dude.
How did they know you had head lice? Because you don't advertise that, do you?
Best friends with this guy, yeah. Him and I were as thick as thieves.
Right, so, was it like one of them shopping channels?
Weirdly, I think it was on the news. It was at the end of the news, they'd be like, and now we've got this comb.
So it's on the news?
Yeah.
I thought you said it was an advert.
Here are the head lice.
Yeah. I think it was a thinly veiled advert, and, you know, so sue me.
You think it was advertorial, that's what you're saying? When was this?
I was pretty young at the time. 10 or 11.
When was that?
When I was in primary school.
Yeah,
when we realised that, we're trying to ascertain the year.
A year on it.
Maybe year 6, I guess. No way, I was much younger.
You haven't said what you had to do in this advert or this appearance.
So I just was the back... You know, like, any time you see someoone's hands in a movie, that's not really their hands.
That's not true.
That is...
What you mean is sometimes when you see someone's hands.
I think every time.
Not every time. Sometimes when they scratch their face, that's their hand. If you see Tom Cruise scratching his face, there's not someone going...
Cruise has got a scratcher. Cruise has got a scratcher.
So, in the 1990s, there was a breakthrough in the treatment of nits in Australia. A new comb was marketed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was so great about it? What was new about it? That the previous
I think
nit
the
combs...
spacing between the teeth on this comb was just really gobsmacking.
Up until then, they were like that far apart. They just...
Unless it's a very big nit.
Yeah. It's the obvious design feature to tinker with on a comb, isn't it?
How did you feel when they offered you this? Because in the one level, oh, I'm going to be on the telly, but showing my nits.
I mean, I know this guy who's dancing in a window to get his foot in the door.
All right, well, what do you think?
You know, mainly because you mixed up advert and news. Otherwise, I'm totally buying it.
Me, I think definitely lie.
I think lie. I think we do think it's a lie. I mean, you have a disconcerting presence.
No.
So in
You say the warmest things to the guests, David.
But there's also something ghostly about you. I wouldn't be surprised if at the next recording they said, wasn't it weird that on Lee's team we only had one guest? I said, no, there was another guest, Sam. He was from Australia. Rob says, there is no such place. But I think we think it's a lie.
They're saying it's a lie.
It's a lie.
Sam, truth or lie?
That's true.
No!